When a fallen prince crowned in ice crosses into a realm where ancient evils stir, even the shadow of Mordor learns to fear. The Lich King brings with him powers that defy the natural order, a blade that hungers for souls, and a will that has already consumed one world. What happens when absolute dominion meets a land fighting for the very concept of freedom? The breach tore through reality above the plains of Rohan like a wound in the fabric of existence itself. Riders of the Mark looked up from their horses in terror as the sky fractured, splintering into crystalline shards of impossible geometry. The air grew cold, far colder than any winter wind, and frost began to spread across the grass in patterns that hurt the eye to follow. The horses screamed and reared, their instincts screaming warnings that their riders barely understood. From within that frozen tear in space stepped a figure that should not exist in Middle-earth. He stood taller than any man, clad in armor of blackened steel, etched with runes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Massive spiked pauldrons framed a helm fashioned in the visage of a screaming face, its empty eyes glowing with an unholy blue radiance. In his gauntleted hand, he carried a blade of terrible beauty, a rune blade that emanated cold and hunger in equal measure, its surface crawling with necromantic energies that whispered promises of eternal service. Arthas Menethil, the Lich King, had arrived in Middle-earth. His presence was a physical weight upon the world, a crushing pressure that made mortal hearts falter and caused the very grass beneath his feet to wither and die. The breach behind him sealed with a sound like breaking ice, leaving only a lingering coldness that would mark that spot for generations. The Lich King stood motionless for a moment, his superhuman senses extending outward to map this new reality he found himself in. He felt it immediately, the presence of another dark power to the east. A malevolent intelligence that had dominated these lands for ages, spreading corruption and fear. Sauron. The name came to Arthas unbidden, plucked from the surface thoughts of the terrified riders who remained frozen in his presence. This dark lord sought dominion through tyranny and terror, building armies of corrupted creatures to crush all resistance. How familiar, how inefficient. Arthas had walked this path before, had seen how crude domination through fear alone created brittle empires that shattered when their master was challenged. True power required more than terror. It required the absolute loyalty of death itself, the transformation of enemies into eternal servants, the cold perfection of undeath that knew no doubt, no fear, no rebellion. The Rohirrim riders finally broke from their paralysis, wheeling their horses around and fleeing toward Doris at a full gallop. Arthas let them go. They would spread word of his arrival, would alert the powers of this world that something new had entered their ancient conflict. Good. Let them come to him with their questions, their offers of alliance, their demands that he leave. He would assess them all with the same cold calculation he had applied to Lordaeron, to Quel'Thalas, to every kingdom that had stood before him. The Lich King began to walk eastward, toward that distant malevolence he sensed. With each step, the ground beneath his feet frosted over, creating a trail of dead earth and ice crystals. Small creatures fled before him, their primitive instincts recognizing a predator beyond their comprehension. Arthas paid them no mind. His thoughts turned inward as he analyzed his situation. He had been locked in eternal contemplation atop the frozen throne, his consciousness simultaneously controlling millions of undead servants across Azeroth, while wrestling with the remnants of his humanity that the cursed blade Frostmourne had left him. Then, without warning, reality had shifted. The throne's bindings had loosened for just a moment, and in that instant, something had pulled at his essence, dragging him through dimensions to this place. The how and why didn't matter yet. What mattered was understanding this world's power structures, its weaknesses, its potential. Already he could sense that death worked differently here. The souls of the fallen didn't linger as strongly as they did in Azeroth. seeming to pass beyond to some other realm more quickly. But this they could be claimed, could be bound to service if one possessed the knowledge and will to do so. And Arthas possessed both in abundance. By the time the sun set on his first day in Middle-earth, the Lich King had already begun to leave his mark. A pack of wargs that had been hunting near the Fangorn forest made the mistake of attacking him, their riders urging them forward with cruel words in the black speech. Arthas didn't even raise Frostmourne. He simply extended his will, and the necromantic energies that surrounded him like an aura lashed out. The wargs collapsed mid-charge, their bodies convulsing as unnatural cold flash froze their blood in their veins. The orc riders tumbled from their dying mounts, scrambling to their feet with weapons raised. They saw death standing before them in the form of an armored giant, and they charged anyway, driven by the will of their distant master and their own savage courage. It availed them nothing. Arthas moved with the speed of something no longer constrained by mortal limitations. Frostmourne singing through the air in a horizontal arc that bisected all three orcs simultaneously. But it was what happened next that truly demonstrated the nature of his power. The souls of the slain, already beginning their journey to whatever afterlife awaited them, were seized by Frostmourne's hungry magic. The corpses twitched, frost spreading across their flesh as necromantic energy flooded into dead tissue. They rose again, empty eyes now burning with the same cold blue light that emanated from Arthas's helm. "Serve," he commanded, his voice a hollow echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The undead orcs bowed their heads in absolute submission. They would never question, never rebel, never feel fear or doubt again. They were his now, the first additions to what would become an army in this new world. Arthas regarded his new servants with satisfaction. The process worked here, perhaps even more smoothly than in Azeroth. This world's lack of sophisticated magic meant fewer protections against necromancy, fewer wards and blessed grounds that could resist the raising of the dead. He continued eastward through the night, tireless as the undeath that sustained him. His new servants followed in perfect silence, their movements mechanical and precise. When dawn came, he had crossed into the lands approaching the Aemin Muil, the rocky maze of hills and valleys that bordered Mordor's western approaches. It was here that he encountered his first substantial force. A patrol of Gondorian rangers, perhaps 50 strong, had been tracking orc movements through the region. They spotted Arthas from a distance, the gleaming runes on his armor visible even in the morning light. Their captain, a weathered man named Faramir, who commanded these forward scouts for his father, the steward of Gondor, called his men to a halt. "What manner of being is that?" one ranger whispered, his hand trembling slightly on his bow. Faramir studied the approaching figure through narrowed eyes. He saw the undead orcs that followed the armored giant, saw the trail of frost and death that marked his passage, and felt a cold dread settle into his stomach. This was no servant of Sauron, at least not one he recognized. The orcs that followed seemed enslaved in a way different from the Dark Lord's dominion, puppeted rather than commanded. "We hail you, stranger!" Faramir called out when Arthas came within speaking distance. "These are the lands under protection of Gondor, the realm of men. By what right do you march here with servants of the enemy?" Arthas stopped, regarding the rangers with the same dispassionate analysis he had applied to the orc patrol. These were different from the primitive orcs, more organized, better equipped with the bearing of professional soldiers. They would make more useful servants, though their numbers were insufficient to matter strategically. "These creatures attacked me," Arthas replied, his voice carrying clearly despite the helm that covered his face. "I defended myself and claimed them as is my right. As for your realm of men, I care nothing for borders drawn by those who lack the power to enforce them. I walk where I will." The rangers shifted uneasily at both the words and the tone. There was no bluster in the statement, no challenge or anger. just the cold certainty of absolute conviction. Faramir felt the same chill he had experienced when facing the Nazgûl, that sense of something fundamentally wrong with the world twisted into a shape that should not exist. You carry yourself as a warrior and speak with authority, Faramir said carefully, his tactical mind racing through options. They were outnumbered if those undead orcs could fight, and something told him this armored figure was far more dangerous than any enemy he had faced. But you walk lands that border Mordor, where the enemy gathers his strength. If you are not his servant, then you should know that all who oppose him are allies in common cause. I serve no one but myself, Arthas stated flatly, and I have no interest in your politics or your wars. I seek only understanding of this world I find myself in. Then let me offer you that understanding, Faramir said, seeing an opportunity. Come with us to Minas Tirith, the White City. There my father and the wise can speak with you, can explain the darkness that threatens all free peoples. If you possess power such as I suspect, we could use allies in the struggle ahead. Arthas considered this. He had intended to continue eastward, to confront this Sauron directly and assess whether the Dark Lord represented a threat or an opportunity. But gathering intelligence first was the prudent course. These rangers could provide information about the political landscape, the military situation, the nature of the powers involved in this conflict. Very well, he agreed. I will accompany you to this city, but know that I grant you no authority over me, Ranger Captain. I come as an observer, nothing more. Faramir nodded, trying not to show his relief. At least the being was rational, capable of communication and negotiation. That was more than could be said for most servants of darkness. Then you are welcome, stranger. May I know your name? I am Arthas Menethil, the Lich King replied. Once Prince of Lordaeron, now something more. The journey to Minas Tirith took 3 days, during which Faramir learned much about their strange guest through careful observation and cautious conversation. Arthas never slept, never ate, never showed any sign of mortal fatigue. He answered questions about his homeland with clinical detachment, describing a world of multiple continents and countless kingdoms, of magic and technology working in concert, of wars against demons and ancient evils that made the ranger's eyes widen in disbelief. But it was his philosophy that troubled Faramir most deeply. When they passed a village that had been burned by orc raiders, the survivors huddled in the ruins of their homes, Arthas showed no emotion at their suffering. He simply observed that such raids would be impossible if the population were properly organized and defended, that individual communities were inherently vulnerable to coordinated assault. These people farm and tend their herds, Faramir explained, trying to understand the stranger's coldness. They are not warriors. Gondor protects them as best we can, but our forces are spread thin. Then they should be relocated to fortified settlements where defense is viable, Arthas replied matter-of-factly, or trained in basic combat and organized into militia units that can respond to threats. Allowing them to maintain this illusion of peaceful rural life when danger lurks in every shadow is both inefficient and cruel. You give them false hope rather than real security. And what of their freedom to live as they choose? Faramir challenged. To raise their families on land their ancestors have worked for generations? Must everything be sacrificed to pure efficiency? Arthas turned his glowing eyes upon the ranger captain, and for a moment Faramir felt the full weight of that inhuman gaze. Freedom is a luxury purchased with the blood of those who have the strength to defend it. These people have neither the strength nor the organization to protect their freedom. So they suffer and die and pray for protection from those who can barely defend themselves. It is a system built on hope and good intentions, and it fails everyone involved. The conversation ended there, but it haunted Faramir throughout the remainder of their journey. There was a terrible logic to Arthas's words, a cold calculation that identified real problems in how the free peoples of Middle-earth organized their defense. But the solution he implied, total control and militarization of all society, seemed as oppressive as the tyranny of Sauron, just arriving from a different direction. When the White City finally came into view, rising in its 7 tiers toward the summit where the Tower of Ecthelion stood sentinel, Arthas paused to study it with professional interest. The fortifications were impressive for their level of technology, the concentric walls providing layered defense, the height advantage maximizing the effectiveness of their archers. But there were vulnerabilities too, supply lines that could be cut, gates that could be breached, population centers vulnerable to siege warfare. Impressive, he said finally, but insufficient against a truly determined assault. How long could you hold against overwhelming force? Long enough, Faramir replied with more confidence than he felt. Minas Tirith has never fallen to enemy assault. Every fortress falls eventually, Arthas observed. The only question is whether the cost of taking it exceeds its strategic value. They entered through the main gates, and Arthas's presence caused immediate disruption. Citizens backed away from the armored giant and his undead servants, making signs against evil and calling for guards. Word spread rapidly through the levels of the city that something strange and terrible had arrived, that Faramir had brought a being of dark power into their midst. By the time they reached the highest level and the Hall of Kings where Denethor held court, a crowd had gathered, soldiers and citizens alike come to see this new arrival. Denethor himself sat upon the steward's seat, his face drawn with the care and suspicion that had increasingly marked his features in recent years. Beside him stood Gandalf the White, who had arrived in the city only the day before with troubling news about the movements of Sauron's forces. The moment Arthas entered the hall, Gandalf's entire demeanor changed. The wizard gripped his staff tightly, and power crackled around him, barely restrained. His ancient eyes, which had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms across ages of the world, recognized something in the armored figure before him that filled him with profound dread. "What have you brought into this city, Faramir?" Gandalf demanded, his voice sharp with alarm. "This being reeks of death and dark sorcery. The very air around him is corrupted." Arthas regarded the wizard with interest. Here at last was someone with real power, someone who might understand what he had become. "I am Arthas Menethil, called the Lich King in my world. Your ranger captain offered me safe conduct to speak with your leaders. I accepted out of curiosity about this realm I find myself in." "The Lich King," Gandalf repeated, his expression darkening further. "A necromancer, then, one who desecrates the dead and binds them to unholy service." He gestured toward the 3 undead orcs that had followed Arthas into the hall. "As is evident from your servants, I am many things," Arthas acknowledged without shame. "Necromancer, warrior, king. I wield the power of death itself, turned toward purpose rather than waste. In my world, I command millions of the undead in service to a vision of perfect order." "Millions?" Denethor leaned forward, his calculating eyes studying Arthas with new intensity. "You command armies of the dead, and you claim to be a king?" "I was a prince before my transformation," Arthas explained. "I ruled the kingdom of Lordaeron before it fell to a plague that turned men into mindless undead. I took up the cursed blade Frostmourne to gain the power to save my people. It cost me my humanity but granted me dominion over death itself. Now I rule an empire of the undead, eternal and absolute in their loyalty." The hall erupted in shocked murmurs and fearful whispers. Gandalf raised his staff, light blazing from its tip. "You confess to dark sorcery as if it were an accomplishment. You admit to commanding the dead, to willingly taking up a cursed blade for power. Do you not see how this damns you? How it marks you as an enemy of all that is good and natural in the world?" Arthas's tone remained unchanged, perfectly calm and rational. "I see that you, like many before you, confuse means with ends. What matters is not the source of power, but how it is applied. My undead serve a purpose. They maintain order. They defend against threats that mortal armies could not withstand. They do not hunger, do not tire, do not question or rebel. They are the perfect subjects for a perfect realm. Perfect? Gandalf's voice rose with barely contained fury. You speak of enslaved souls, of desecration of the dead, as if it were some grand achievement. There is nothing perfect in perverting the natural order, in binding spirits that should pass on to their rest. And yet your people face an enemy who cares nothing for your philosophies about the natural order. Arthas countered, his tone still maddeningly level. This Sauron you fight builds his own armies through corruption and domination. From what I sensed in his distant presence, he too commands creatures who serve without question, who know nothing but obedience to his will. How am I different, save that I am honest about what I have become? The difference, Gandalf said through gritted teeth, is that Sauron is recognized as the enemy. He does not enter our halls claiming to be anything but what he is, the Dark Lord, the enemy of the free peoples. You present yourself as if you might be an ally, as if your methods were simply an alternative approach to common goals. But I tell you plainly, Arthas Menethil, that there is no common ground between the living and the unnatural mockery you represent. Denethor had been listening to this exchange with intense focus, his shrewd mind working through possibilities. You say you command millions, that you wield power over death itself. If this is true, you represent a force that could turn the tide against Mordor. Gandalf speaks of corruption and desecration, but I see only a potential advantage against an enemy who has already brought us to the brink of destruction. Father, no, Faramir interjected, shock evident in his voice. Surely you cannot consider alliance with one who admits to such dark practices. I consider whatever gives Gondor the best chance of survival. Denethor snapped, then returned his attention to Arthas. You claim to have faced great evils in your own world. What do you make of Sauron and the threat he represents? Arthas was silent for a moment, his superhuman senses reaching out to probe that distant malevolence more thoroughly now that he was closer to its source. He is powerful, he acknowledged, ancient and cunning, with deep roots in this world's fundamental forces, but his methods are crude, relying on fear and overwhelming force rather than true control. His servants worship or fear him, but that creates vulnerabilities. Fear can be overcome. Worship can be shattered by defeat. True dominion requires something more absolute. And you possess this true dominion? Denethor pressed. In my realm, yes. Here, I would need time to establish my presence, to build the infrastructure necessary for large-scale necromantic operations. But it could be done. Given access to your battlefields, to the fallen from both sides, I could raise an army that would never tire, never break, never retreat. Combined with your living forces, such an alliance would be unstoppable. The hall erupted in outraged shouts and fearful protests. Many in attendance were calling for Arthas to be cast out immediately, while others, particularly among the soldiers, looked thoughtful at the strategic possibilities he described. Gandalf slammed his staff against the floor, the sharp crack of its impact silencing the crowd. This is madness, the wizard declared. You speak of defiling the honored dead of Gondor, of turning fathers and sons and brothers into shambling corpses to serve this creature's will. Is this what we have come to? Are we so desperate that we would embrace the very darkness we claim to oppose? We are desperate, Gandalf, Denethor said quietly, but with steel in his voice. Every day brings new reports of Mordor's growing strength. Osgiliath has fallen, our borders shrink, and when the full might of the enemy is unleashed upon us, will your wisdom and high ideals hold back the darkness? Or will we burn while you lecture us on the proper methods of warfare? Better to burn free than to serve as undead slaves, Gandalf shot back. Better to fall defending what we believe than to become the very evil we fight against. Arthas had been watching this exchange with clinical interest, analyzing the divisions and tensions within the leadership of this realm. Now he spoke, his cold voice cutting through the argument. You debate as if I have offered myself as a servant to your cause. I have not. I owe you nothing, feel no obligation to your realm or your people. I came here seeking knowledge, nothing more. Then why remain? Gandalf demanded. If you care nothing for our struggle, return to whatever dark realm spawned you and leave Middle-earth to its own fate. Because this Sauron intrigues me, Arthas replied honestly. He has built an empire on fear and corruption, much as I once attempted to do before I understood the limitations of such methods. I am curious to see whether he has solved the problems I encountered, or whether he will ultimately fail, as all tyrants do when their power is challenged. You speak of him as if he were an academic subject, Faramir said, his voice a mixture of confusion and revulsion, as if the suffering he causes, the lives he destroys, were merely data points in some experiment. Arthas turned his glowing gaze upon the ranger. What is suffering but inefficiency? What are the lives lost but resources wasted? You cling to emotional attachments that cloud your judgment and weaken your strategic thinking. I see clearly because I feel nothing. No pity, no remorse, no doubt. Only purpose. Then you are truly lost, Gandalf said with profound sadness in his voice. Whatever you once were, Arthas Menethil, it is gone now. What stands before us is merely a shell, an empty vessel filled with cold ambition and dark power. You cannot be reasoned with because you lack the very qualities that make reasoning meaningful: empathy, compassion, the ability to value life beyond its utility. For the first time, something flickered in Arthas's tone, a ghost of what might have been emotion. I was those things once. I felt everything you claim I lack, and those feelings led me to make the choices that damn me. I took up Frostmourne out of love for my people, out of desperate need to save them from the plague that ravaged my kingdom. Every step down the path that made me what I am was paved with noble intentions and genuine care for those I swore to protect. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had returned to its customary coldness. Those feelings accomplished nothing but my own corruption. They were weaknesses exploited by the very evil I sought to defeat. Now I am beyond such vulnerabilities, and I am far more effective for it. So spare me your pity, wizard. I need it not. The hall had fallen silent during this exchange, every ear straining to hear the words of the fallen prince. Some saw only a monster justifying evil deeds. Others, particularly those who had faced impossible choices in desperate times, saw something more troubling, a reflection of what anyone might become if pushed far enough. It was Denethor who broke the silence. Regardless of philosophical debates about the nature of your being, you are here and you possess power. I would know your intentions plainly. Do you ally with Sauron, oppose him, or remain neutral in the conflict that engulfs these lands? Arthas considered the question. Sauron represents disorder. Despite his claims of bringing order through domination, his rule is based on fear, which breeds resentment, and resentment breeds rebellion. He has created a realm where his subjects serve only because they are terrified, not because they are truly bound to his will. Such a system is fundamentally flawed and ultimately doomed to fail. That does not answer the question, Gandalf observed. I oppose him because his approach is inefficient, Arthas stated, not because I care about your freedom or your way of life. If I were to establish myself in this realm, his presence would be an obstacle. Therefore, he must be removed. But make no mistake, wizard, what I would build in his place would be no more palatable to you than what he offers. At least you're honest, Faramir muttered. Always, Arthas replied. Lies are inefficient. They require maintenance and can be exposed. Truth, even unpleasant truth, is stable and reliable. Before anyone could respond, a commotion arose from outside the hall. A soldier rushed in, his face pale with urgency. My lord Denethor, news from the eastern borders. A massive force has emerged from Minas Morgul, hundreds of orcs and trolls, led by at least 2 of the Nazgûl. They march for the Pelennor fields. Denethor rose from his seat, his expression grim. How long until they reach the walls? 2 hours, perhaps less. They move with unnatural speed. Sound the alarm, Denethor commanded. Man the walls, call up all reserves. If they mean to test our defenses, we shall teach them the strength of Gondor. He turned to Arthas. It seems you will have an opportunity to demonstrate whether your claims of power match your boasts, stranger. Will you stand with us on the walls, or will you observe from safety while others fight and die? Arthas's response was immediate. I will meet them in the field. Your walls are adequate for defense, but I am not built for cowering behind fortifications. I am a weapon, and weapons are meant to be used. You would face hundreds alone? Faramir asked, incredulous. I have faced worse odds and prevailed, Arthas replied simply. He turned toward the great doors of the hall. Clear the gates. I will show you what true power looks like. And perhaps your people will understand that there are forces in the multiverse that dwarf your petty conflicts with this Sauron. Gandalf moved to block his path, staff raised. I cannot allow you to exit this city to do who knows what dark sorcery on the fields beyond. You may be powerful, but I am not without strength myself. Arthas regarded the wizard with something approaching respect. You would challenge me, knowing what I am. That is either courage or foolishness, and I suspect you have lived too long to be foolish. I am Gandalf the White, servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Aenor, the wizard declared, power crackling around him, and I will not stand aside while you bring further darkness to these lands. The Lich King's armored hand moved to Frostmourne's hilt. Then we shall test which is stronger, your divine purpose or my terrible evolution. But know this, wizard, I have slain beings of power before. Some claimed divinity. None survived to test that claim twice. The air in the hall grew heavy with gathering power. Two immense forces preparing to clash in a confrontation that would likely devastate the surrounding area. Soldiers backed away toward the exits, while Denethor watched with calculating eyes, perhaps hoping both threats would eliminate each other. It was Faramir who stepped between them, his very mortality a stark contrast to the powers facing off around him. Please, both of you, the true enemy approaches our gates. Whatever conflict exists between you can be settled after we face the immediate threat. Surely even you, Gandalf, can see the tactical advantage in allowing this being to fight against Sauron's forces, allowing him to demonstrate his dark arts on our doorstep, to raise our own fallen as his servants. Gandalf's voice was harsh. That is a price too high. Then I make you this offer, Arthas said, surprising everyone. I will destroy the approaching force without raising a single fallen defender of Gondor. I need no such handicap to prove my capabilities. When they see what I can do with my existing power alone, then you may judge whether my methods are worth your moral outrage. Gandalf studied the Lich King intently, his ancient wisdom probing for deception. Finding only cold sincerity, he finally nodded. Very well, but I will be watching, Arthas Menethil. Should you break this promise, should you desecrate even one fallen son of Gondor, I will strike you down with every ounce of power at my command, regardless of the cost. I would expect nothing less, Arthas replied, then strode past the wizard toward the great doors. The gates of Minas Tirith swung open, and the Lich King emerged onto the Pelennor fields as horns sounded across the White City. Soldiers rushed to man the walls, archers knocking arrows, and spearmen taking positions behind the battlements. Gandalf and Faramir climbed to the highest point of the walls where they could observe what was about to unfold. In the distance, the army of Mordor approached like a dark stain spreading across the green fields. Orcs in their thousands, trolls wielding great clubs and chains, and above them flew two of the Nazgûl atop their fell beasts, their black robes streaming behind them like funeral shrouds. The very air around them seemed to darken, and the temperature dropped wherever their shadows fell. Arthas walked toward them alone, his 3 undead orc servants following silently behind him. To the watchers on the walls, it looked like suicide, like some form of elaborate madness. But Gandalf, whose vision extended beyond mortal sight, saw the power gathering around the Lich King, necromantic energies coiling and building like a storm about to break. When Arthas was perhaps 100 yards from the enemy vanguard, he stopped. He raised Frostmourne high, the rune blade blazing with cold blue fire that seemed to drink in the very light around it. Then he drove the tip of the blade into the ground, and the world itself shuddered. From the point of impact, waves of necromantic energy exploded outward in concentric circles, racing across the field faster than any horse could run. Where that energy touched the ground, frost spread in intricate patterns, and the very earth seemed to die. The grass blackened and crumbled to ash. The soil froze solid, becoming as hard as stone. The orc vanguard hit that expanding wave of death and simply stopped, their bodies seizing up as the life was violently ripped from them. They fell in perfect circles, hundreds dying in seconds without a single blow being struck. The trolls behind them roared in confusion and rage, their dim minds unable to comprehend what was happening. They charged forward, only to meet the same fate, collapsing mid-stride as Frostmourne's hunger claimed them. The Nazgûl shrieked, their fell beasts veering away from the expanding death zone. But Arthas was not finished. He raised his free hand, and from his outstretched palm, a beam of concentrated necromantic energy lanced skyward, striking one of the Nazgûl directly. The ringwraith's shriek reached a pitch that shattered glass in the lower levels of Minas Tirith, and then it was falling, its fell beast dead before it hit the ground, the Nazgûl itself temporarily dispersed by the sheer power of the attack. On the walls, soldiers stared in stunned silence. In less than a minute, Arthas had killed hundreds of enemy soldiers and driven off one of the most feared servants of Sauron. And he had barely moved from where he stood. But the Lich King was just beginning. He pulled Frostmourne from the ground and pointed it at the fallen orcs and trolls that littered the field before him. "Rise," he commanded, and the word carried across the field with the weight of absolute authority. They rose. Hundreds of corpses lurched back to their feet, no longer creatures of flesh and will, but animated puppets bound to Arthas's control. Their eyes blazed with the same blue light that emanated from his helm, and they turned as one toward the remainder of the attacking force, which had ground to a halt in terror and confusion. "Kill them all," Arthas ordered, and his new army surged forward with mechanical precision. What followed was not so much a battle as an execution. The undead felt no fear, no pain, no fatigue. They advanced in perfect formation, overwhelming their former comrades through sheer relentless coordination. The living orcs broke and ran, their morale shattered by the sight of their dead companions animated against them. The trolls fought on with bestial fury but were dragged down by sheer numbers, their massive strength meaningless against opponents who could not be killed because they were already dead. The remaining Nazgûl fled, its fell beast winging rapidly back toward Minas Morgul, driven off by a power it had no reference for understanding. In 15 minutes, the entire attacking force was destroyed or scattered, and Arthas stood at the center of a field of undead servants, his army now numbering in the hundreds. He turned back toward Minas Tirith and walked slowly toward the gates, his undead following in perfect ranks behind him. On the walls, no one spoke. The silence was broken only by the sound of armored footsteps on stone as Arthas approached. Gandalf stood at the gate, his face pale but his staff still raised. "You gave your word you would not raise fallen defenders of Gondor, and I kept it," Arthas replied, gesturing to his undead army. "These were all servants of your enemy. I have desecrated no ally, violated no trust. This is what I can accomplish with enemies alone. Imagine what an alliance could achieve." "I see only horror," Gandalf said, his voice shaking slightly. "You have turned the very weapon of the enemy against itself, yes, but in doing so you have demonstrated that you are no better than he is. Perhaps worse, for Sauron at least makes no pretense of his nature. I make no pretense either," Arthas countered, I told you exactly what I am and what I would do. You chose to allow it, hoping that I would fail or that the display would be less effective than claimed. Instead, I have proven that my power is real and my methods effective. Now you must decide what that means for your precious alliance of free peoples. Denethor had descended from the tower and now stood just inside the gate. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes gleamed with calculations. You have done Gondor a service this day, Arthas Menethil. That force would have breached our outer defenses and cost us hundreds of lives to repel. Instead, we have lost no one, and you have given us an object lesson in power. Father, Faramir objected, surely you cannot mean to welcome this necromancer into our councils. I mean to be practical, Denethor snapped. Gondor stands alone against the darkness. Rohan does not answer our beacons. The elves prepare to depart these shores. The dwarves hide in their mountains. And you would have me turn away a power that can destroy armies with a gesture because his methods offend our sensibilities? Yes, Gandalf said firmly, because the moment we embrace such methods, we become what we fight against. There must be lines we will not cross, even in the face of destruction. Otherwise, our victory would be hollow, our survival purchased at the cost of everything that makes life worth living. Arthas listened to this debate with the same analytical detachment he had shown throughout. You argue philosophy while your enemy gathers strength. This is why mortals so often fail when faced with existential threats. You cannot separate ideals from necessity, cannot make the hard choices required for survival. And you have made those hard choices, Faramir challenged. Traded your humanity for power, your soul for strength. What did it gain you? You claim to rule millions of undead, to command forces across your world, but you do not seem content or fulfilled. You seem empty. For a moment, something flickered behind Arthas's glowing eyes. A ghost of the man he had been, perhaps, or just the recognition of a truth he had long since accepted. I am empty, he acknowledged. Frostmourne consumed my soul when I claimed it. Everything I was burned away, leaving only purpose and will. But that emptiness is also my strength. I am not distracted by doubt or fear or the weakness of mortal emotion. I see clearly and act decisively. That is not strength, Gandalf said quietly. It is merely the absence of humanity masquerading as power. True strength comes from having those feelings, those doubts and fears and loves, and choosing to act righteously despite them. What you call weakness is actually the very thing that makes existence meaningful. Meaning is irrelevant, Arthas replied. Only outcomes matter. Then we truly have nothing more to discuss, Gandalf concluded. You cannot be swayed because you literally cannot feel the force of moral argument. You are beyond redemption, not because of what you have done, but because you lack the capacity to even recognize redemption as desirable. Arthas nodded, accepting this assessment without argument. Then let us speak of tactics rather than morality. This Sauron you face, what are his capabilities? What are his weaknesses? If I am to oppose him, I must understand him. It was Faramir who answered, perhaps seeing an opportunity to keep Arthas focused on their common enemy rather than threatening Gondor itself. He is the Dark Lord of Mordor, an ancient Maya corrupted by power and malice. His strength is in his vast armies and his ability to inspire terror. His greatest weapon is the One Ring, a device of power that grants dominion over all the other rings and their bearers. A phylactery, then, Arthas mused. A physical anchor for his power and essence. Destroy the ring, destroy the master. Interesting. In my world, I encountered similar constructs, though none quite so sophisticated. Where is this ring now? Gandalf stiffened, immediately recognizing the danger in revealing such information. That is not knowledge we share with strangers, particularly those who have proven themselves as dangerous as any servant of the enemy. I ask not to claim it, but to understand the strategic situation, Arthas said. If this ring is the key to Sauron's defeat, surely it is being employed toward that end. Yet your city prepares for siege, which suggests the ring is not in your possession. Therefore, someone else has it, someone working toward its destruction while you distract the enemy's forces. The accuracy of his deduction made Gandalf's expression darken further. You reason too well for comfort, Lich King. It is logical strategy, Arthas replied. In your position, I would do the same. Send an expendable force to destroy the enemy's power source while the main army holds his attention. Crude but potentially effective, assuming your agents can penetrate his defenses and survive long enough to complete the task. They will succeed, Gandalf said with more confidence than he felt. There is more to this quest than mere military strategy. Forces are at work that even you, with all your dark power, cannot comprehend. Destiny, fate, divine providence, Arthas said dismissively. I have heard such claims before. They always prove to be either self-fulfilling prophecies or rationalizations for failure. What matters is power, position, and timing. If your agents have those advantages, they may succeed. If not, all your faith will not save them. Your cynicism is exhausting, Faramir observed. Do you believe in nothing beyond power? I believe in what can be proven, Arthas replied. Power can be measured, tested, observed. Everything else is speculation masquerading as certainty. Denethor had been listening with increasing impatience. This philosophical debate achieves nothing. Arthas Menethil, you have demonstrated your power and your willingness to strike against Sauron's forces. Will you continue to do so, or will you turn that power against Gondor itself? I have no interest in Gondor beyond its strategic position. Arthas answered honestly, your city matters only as a piece on a larger board. If you oppose me, I will destroy you. If you ally with me, I will defend you. If you remain neutral, I will ignore you. The choice is yours. Those are not the choices of an ally, but of a conqueror, Gandalf pointed out. I never claimed otherwise, Arthas said. I told you from the beginning what I am. You chose to bring me into your city, to allow me to demonstrate my capabilities. Now you face the consequences of that choice. Which are, Denethor asked carefully, that I am here, in the heart of your realm, commanding an army of undead mere yards from your gate. Arthas replied, you cannot force me to leave, cannot threaten me with any power at your disposal save perhaps the wizard, and even he would find me a difficult opponent. So we negotiate from a position where I hold considerable advantage. You hold nothing, Gandalf declared, power beginning to radiate from him. I will not allow you to threaten this city or its people. Leave now, Arthas Menethil, or I will drive you out by force. The Lich King regarded the wizard with cold calculation. You would risk destroying much of the city in such a confrontation. I am powerful, Gandalf. Perhaps more so than you realize. The battle between us would be catastrophic for all around us. Then leave peacefully, Gandalf countered. Or? Arthas challenged. The standoff stretched, two immense powers facing off while the leadership of Gondor watched in growing dread. It was finally broken by an unexpected source. Aragorn, who had been traveling from the north with a company of rangers, arrived at that moment, pushing through the gathering crowd at the gate. Gandalf, what is this? Aragorn demanded, taking in the scene. His eyes fell on Arthas and the army of undead behind him, and his hand went instinctively to his sword. What manner of creature stands in our gate? He calls himself the Lich King, Gandalf explained quickly. A necromancer of terrible power from another realm. He has just destroyed an attacking force from Mordor, but now makes veiled threats against Gondor itself. Aragorn studied Arthas with the keen eye of a ranger and a leader. He saw the power, yes, but also the emptiness, the hollow nature of the being before him. You are death incarnate, he said slowly. Not merely a wielder of necromancy, but something that has transcended life entirely. What do you want in Middle-earth? Understanding first, Arthas replied, his tone almost respectful toward this newcomer. Then perhaps purpose. Your world is in the midst of a conflict with a dark power that claims dominion through fear and corruption. I am curious whether he succeeds where I have succeeded, or fails where I learn to adapt. You speak of Sauron as if he were an experiment, Aragorn observed. Everything is an experiment, Arthas countered. Every choice, every strategy, every system of government. Some work, some fail. The wise learn from both. And you have learned much? Aragorn asked. I have learned that power without absolute control is wasted. Arthas said that fear as a tool has limitations, that only the perfect loyalty of the undead can truly secure lasting order. These lessons were purchased at great cost, but they are proven truth. Proven in your world, perhaps, Aragorn said. But Middle-earth is not your laboratory, Lich King. We have our own ways, our own truths, and we will defend them against all who would remake us in their image, whether they come from Mordor or from realms beyond our knowing. Arthas inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the challenge in Aragorn's words. Spoken like a true leader, you are different from the steward, less calculating, more principled. This must be the heir of Isildur that I have heard mentioned. I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, he confirmed, and I would know your intentions plainly. Are you friend or foe to the free peoples of Middle-earth? Neither, Arthas replied. I am observer and, if circumstances warrant, participant, but I serve no cause save my own understanding. If that aligns with your interests, we may work in concert. If not, we will part ways or come into conflict as circumstances dictate. That is not an answer, Aragorn pressed. It is the only answer I can give honestly, Arthas countered. Would you prefer I lie and claim to serve your cause while pursuing my own agenda? Or that I pledge loyalty I have no intention of keeping? I offer truth, unvarnished and uncomfortable as it may be. Aragorn turned to Gandalf. Can we afford to have such a power loose in Middle-earth during our darkest hour? Even if he opposes Sauron, he may prove as dangerous to us as to our enemy. I have been considering that very question, Gandalf admitted, and I confess I know not the answer. He is powerful enough to be a significant factor in the coming conflict, but his nature is so fundamentally opposed to everything we fight for that alliance seems impossible. Then perhaps stalemate, Denethor suggested. Neither ally nor enemy, but a third force that we acknowledge and work around rather than with or against. An interesting proposal, Arthas said. I would be free to pursue my own investigations and act as I see fit, while you neither aid nor oppose me. Should our paths cross in battle against common foes, we coordinate temporarily. Otherwise, we ignore each other's presence. Could you honor such an arrangement? Aragorn asked skeptically. Could you restrain yourself from raising fallen defenders of Gondor, from building an undead army from our casualties? Arthas considered this carefully. For a time, yes. I have reserves of power sufficient for my purposes without needing to add every corpse I encounter. And there is strategic value in demonstrating restraint, in showing that I can be dealt with reasonably rather than having every hand turned against me. For a time, Gandalf repeated, catching the qualification, but not indefinitely. Eventually, your nature would assert itself, and you would begin to see all who die as potential servants. Eventually, all things change, Arthas agreed, but the immediate crisis you face will be resolved one way or another before my patience for restraint expires. If Sauron is defeated, I will likely return to my own realm. If he prevails, I will oppose him directly. Either way, your concerns about my long-term intentions are premature. The gathering debated among themselves in hurried whispers. Finally, Aragorn spoke for them. We accept this stalemate, but with conditions. You may not enter Minas Tirith again save under escort and with explicit permission. You may not raise any fallen from among the forces of the free peoples. And should you break these conditions, we will unite against you regardless of the cost. Acceptable, Arthas agreed. I will establish myself elsewhere and pursue my own investigation of this Sauron and his methods. We will meet again when circumstances warrant, either as temporary allies against common threats or as enemies if your terms are violated. He turned to leave, his undead army following in perfect formation. At the edge of hearing, his voice drifted back. You should know that this Sauron prepares a major offensive. I sensed it in the movements of his power while I fought his servants. A great host gathers in Mordor, larger than anything your chroniclers have recorded. Your stalemate with me is purchased partly because you will need every advantage when that host marches. Remember that when you contemplate whether you made the right choice today. Then he was gone, his armored form disappearing into the distance, trailed by hundreds of undead orcs that marched with mechanical precision. The gates of Minas Tirith closed, and those who remained in the citadel were left to contemplate what had just transpired. We have made a devil's bargain, Gandalf said heavily. Allowed a creature of darkness to roam free in Middle-earth because we fear to challenge him at our moment of greatest weakness. We have acknowledged a reality we cannot change, Aragorn countered, that being exists whether we will it or not. At least now we have some understanding with him rather than having him as an active enemy. Understanding with a Lich King, Faramir said, shaking his head. I never thought to see such a day. These are days of wonders and terrors both, Aragorn replied. The old certainties fail us, and we must adapt or perish. Arthas Menethil is merely one more impossibility in an age that seems to specialize in them. They retreated into the city to make what preparations they could for the coming storm, while in the distance the Lich King established himself in the ruins of Osgiliath, raising the fallen from that abandoned city to swell his ranks. He studied Mordor from across the river Anduin, his mind analyzing the fortress realm, identifying weaknesses and formulating strategies. Days passed, and the tension built across Middle-earth as forces gathered for the final confrontation. Aragorn prepared to lead a desperate march on the Black Gate itself, a diversion meant to draw Sauron's attention while the ring-bearers completed their quest. Gandalf counseled the leaders of the Free Peoples, trying to forge unity among elves, dwarves, and men for what might be their last stand. And Arthas watched it all from his chosen vantage, noting the movements of armies, the flow of power, the gathering of wills toward a single point of crisis. When the armies of the West finally marched toward Mordor, he followed at a distance, curious to see how this conflict would resolve. The Black Gate opened, and the hosts of Mordor poured forth in numbers that darkened the plains. The forces of the West, pitifully small by comparison, held their ground with desperate courage. Arthas observed the initial clash, saw the discipline and valor of mortal men facing impossible odds, and found it interesting. They fought not because they expected victory, but because surrender was unthinkable. They stood not because they had hope, but because their values demanded it. It was inefficient, illogical, and undeniably courageous in a way his undead could never replicate. When the battle seemed lost, when the forces of the West were surrounded and being crushed from all sides, Arthas made his decision. He raised Frostmourne and led his undead army into the fray, striking the forces of Mordor from an unexpected angle. The orcs of Sauron found themselves caught between the desperate resistance of the West and the relentless assault of the undead army. Confusion spread through their ranks as former comrades, raised by Arthas from previous battles, attacked with mechanical efficiency. The tide of battle shifted, not toward victory, but toward a prolonged stalemate that gave the ring-bearers precious time. Gandalf, seeing Arthas enter the battle, knew what it meant. The ring-bearer approaches his goal, the wizard said to Aragorn. Sauron's attention is divided between us and this new threat. Frodo has his chance. In the distance, Mount Doom erupted. The ground heaved and a shockwave of pure psychic agony rolled across the battlefield as Sauron's essence, bound to the One Ring, was sundered and dispersed. The Dark Lord's forces collapsed into chaos, leaderless and purposeless without the will that had driven them. Arthas felt the explosion of power and understood immediately what had occurred. The phylactery had been destroyed, the master undone by the loss of his anchor. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effect. He had learned something valuable about the construction and vulnerabilities of such devices. The battle ended not with a final clash, but with the dissolution of one side entirely. The remaining orcs fled or turned on each other, their crude civilization collapsing without Sauron's dominating presence to hold it together. The forces of the West stood victorious, battered and exhausted but alive. Arthas approached the leaders of the West where they stood amid the carnage, his undead army arrayed behind him in perfect ranks. Gandalf and Aragorn met him warily, hands near weapons but not yet drawn. An impressive stratagem, Arthas acknowledged. The destruction of a power source while the enemy was distracted by direct confrontation. Simple, but executed with precision. Your ring-bearers were more capable than I anticipated. They were brave beyond measure, Gandalf corrected. That is what you fail to understand, Lich King. It was not capability that saw them through, but courage and friendship and the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. Semantics, Arthas dismissed. They succeeded, which is what matters. Your enemy is defeated, his realm in ruins. What happens now? Now we rebuild, Aragorn said firmly. We reclaim what was lost and create a new age for Middle-earth, one based on freedom and cooperation rather than domination and fear. It will fail, Arthas predicted flatly. Without a common enemy, your alliance will fracture. Men will squabble over borders and resources. Old grudges will resurface. Within a generation, you will have petty wars and territorial disputes. Within a century, someone will arise claiming to impose order through strength, and the cycle will repeat. Perhaps, Aragorn acknowledged, but those will be our mistakes to make, our lessons to learn. We choose the difficult path of freedom over the easy certainty of tyranny, even knowing it may lead to hardship. Then you are fools, Arthas said, but there was something almost like respect in his tone. Principled fools, but fools nonetheless. And what of you, Lich King? Gandalf asked. Will you honor our agreement and depart now that the crisis has passed? Arthas looked around at the ruined battlefield, at the broken remnants of Mordor in the distance, at the celebrating soldiers of the West. He had learned what he came to learn, had seen how this world's conflicts resolved. There was nothing more for him here. I will depart, he confirmed. But know this, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and you, Gandalf the White. The multiverse is vast and filled with threats you cannot imagine. The breach that brought me here is but one of countless thin places between realities. Others will come, perhaps benevolent, perhaps far worse than Sauron ever was. Your choice of freedom over security may prove fatal when you face enemies against whom courage and friendship are insufficient weapons. We will face those threats when they come, Aragorn replied steadily. As ourselves, with our values intact, that is worth any risk. Arthas nodded, accepting this as the final word on their philosophical divide. He raised his hand, and reality began to tear once more, a portal forming in the air before him. Through it could be glimpsed a frozen wasteland, a massive throne of ice, and the sense of endless undead armies awaiting their master's return. Remember this when the next darkness comes, Arthas said as he prepared to step through. That you had the chance to learn from one who had mastered the tools you will need. That you chose comfort over survival, familiar weakness over unfamiliar strength. And remember that in all the infinite realms beyond your knowing, I will remember you as the world that preferred to remain small rather than dare to become great. He stepped through the portal, his undead army following in perfect formation, hundreds of corrupted orcs returning to Azeroth as new servants of the Scourge. The portal collapsed behind them, leaving only a lingering coldness and the memory of what had transpired. Gandalf and Aragorn stood in silence for a long moment, processing what they had witnessed and what they had narrowly avoided becoming. Do you think he was right? Aragorn asked quietly. that we will face greater threats and find our principles inadequate. Perhaps, Gandalf admitted, but his alternative was to become like him, empty and powerful and ultimately alone. I would rather face 1,000 threats with hope and humanity intact than survive as a hollow shell like the Lich King. Some prices are too high to pay, even for survival. I hope you're right, Aragorn said, because if you're wrong, we may have doomed Middle-earth by choosing honor over pragmatism. If I am wrong, Gandalf replied, then at least we will fall as ourselves, true to what we believe. That is worth more than any empire built on the enslavement of souls. They turned back toward their people, toward the celebration and mourning that would mark this pivotal day in the history of Middle-earth. Behind them, the spot where Arthas had opened his portal remained cold, frost never quite melting from the stone, a permanent reminder of the Lich King's visit and the choice that had been made. In Minas Tirith, chroniclers would write of that day, of the golden victory against Sauron and the strange, terrible power that had come and gone like a dark comet across their history. Some would paint Arthas as a hero who aided in their moment of need. Others would call him a demon barely restrained from consuming them all. The truth, as always, was more complex than either version. The Lich King had been neither savior nor destroyer, but something more troubling. A mirror held up to their own potential darkness. A vision of what any of them might become if they valued results over means, survival over soul. That he had departed was a mercy, but also a warning. The multiverse was wider than they had known, filled with powers and philosophies that challenged everything they believed. Middle-earth had survived not just Sauron but also Arthas Menethil, and in doing so had affirmed its commitment to its own values even in the face of overwhelming power that promised easier paths. Whether that choice would prove wise or fatal remained to be seen, but it had been made freely, which was perhaps the point. In another realm, in another reality entirely, Arthas sat once more upon the frozen throne, his consciousness expanding to touch the millions of undead servants that comprised his eternal army. He had learned much from his time in Middle-earth, about power, about resistance, about the strange strength that came from unity born of choice rather than compulsion. It changed nothing about his methods or his goals, but it added to his understanding of the multiverse and its infinite variations on the theme of order versus chaos, control versus freedom. Middle-earth had chosen freedom and somehow prevailed. Others made different choices and met different fates. The great game continued, across infinite realities and endless time. The Lich King would remember them, those principled fools who had rejected his offer of certain survival in favor of uncertain freedom. And perhaps, in the cold emptiness where his soul once resided, something almost like respect remained for those who dared to face the darkness on their own terms, rather than become darkness themselves to survive it. The story of Middle-earth and the Lich King ended not with destruction or conquest, but with separation and mutual recognition. Two philosophies had met, clashed, and ultimately parted ways without resolution because none was possible. Each would continue on their chosen path, convinced of their own rightness, aware of the other's existence, but no longer in conflict. It was perhaps the best outcome possible when irreconcilable worldviews encountered each other. Not victory for either side, but acknowledgement and divergence. The multiverse was large enough for both, and perhaps that was the ultimate truth that neither Arthas nor Gandalf would ever fully accept. Freedom and order, chaos and control, life and undeath. Each had their champions, their philosophies, their eternal arguments. And in the spaces between realities, those arguments would continue forever, unresolved and unresolvable. The fundamental tension that drove all existence toward its unknown destiny.